In the early 1840s, so legend has it, Horace Greeley, famed newspaper editor and owner, was walking down the streets of New York when he is approached by a young man who seems to be in some type of distress. The young man proceeds to relate to Greeley all of his problems, and he looks at him. He says, "Mr. Greeley, what do you think I should do?" Greeley looks at him and simply says, according to myth and legend, pointing his finger, "Go west, young man, go west." And that story, of course, simply points out what has always been the impetus for a lot of things that happened within early American history. People who came from Europe went west. The people who landed on the East Coast went west. West was always the be all and end all, the solution to all problems, the interminable amount of land that existed could always hold out hope. Go west, young man. And it's that very, what later became known as manifest destiny, which was going to push the United States into a war which would lead to an even more terrible war. So we're going to take a look at today the date that you see on the screen, April 25th, 1846, the official beginning of the Mexican American War. Or, one individual said, would poison us. A war that is going to lead, you could argue, almost directly to the American Civil War. So let's take a look at the causes, the effects, and some of the happenings during the Mexican-American War. Its roots lay in the war that, of course, was fought in Texas in the 1830s, the War for Texas Independence from Mexico. Remember the Alamo, of course, had become a famous catchphrase in American history. Against unbeatable odds, the hundred and some defenders of the Alamo held out for what became known as the 13 days. Eventually, the Alamo would be captured, and iconic figures in American history, Jim Bowie, Davy Crockett, Colonel Travis, would all meet their ends in the Alamo. But that would be the inspiration eventually for the Texas independence movement, which would find its hero in a gentleman by the name of Sam Houston. Houston, close friend to the President of the United States at that time, Andy Jackson. So Houston will become the first president of the Republic of Texas. They will immediately ask for recognition by the United States and to become a state. Jackson kind of pushes it off, realizing that bringing Texas into the United States as a slave state, or possibly because of its size, many slave states, would push the United States into crisis mode. So their call for statehood was rejected. They become the Lone Star Republic. And of course, Texas is still known today as the Lone Star State. So they will become an independent country. The final battle for that Texas independence would be the Battle of San Jacinto. Remember the Alamo, remember Goliad, all of those, of course, massacres perpetrated by the Mexican army, led by a general named Santa Anna. Santa Anna is going to become a key player in the Mexican-American War, which takes place some 10 years after. Once Texas independence had been recognized by Santa Anna, who had been captured at that battle, an uneasy truce takes place between Texas and the Mexicans. Because even though they had recognized the independence of Texas, they still didn't really accept it. And there was always the hope that eventually they would bring Texas back into the Mexican fold. So, what eventually prompted this war some 10 years later? First of all, you have this man, James K. Polk. Polk, from Tennessee, like one of his predecessors, Andy Jackson, was a nationalist. He looked upon the entire country and a country that needed to expand. He was one of the proponents of manifest destiny. And of course, all the land west of the Louisiana Purchase, for the most part, was controlled by two entities. One was Great Britain in the northwestern United States along the Pacific coast, and the other, of course, and the bulk of the land controlled by Mexico, which had gained its freedom from Spain in 1824. So Polk, in running for president, pushed the idea that that land was rightfully the United States under the auspices of manifest destiny. So Polk, one of the dark horse candidates for the nomination, pushes this idea of manifest destiny and will secure the presidency. One of the things that, of course, was uppermost in America's mind was eventually, where was the northwestern border of the United States? The dispute between Great Britain and the United States was over what was then known as the Oregon Territory. And what Polk wanted, and what the campaign slogan that he engendered became, was 54-40 or fight. 54-40 or fight. In the meantime, there was constantly a boundary dispute between the United States, or I should say between Mexico and Texas. According to the Texans' view, it was the Rio Grande River, which of course it currently is today. According to the Mexicans and the treaty they find granting Texas independence, it was the Nueces River. As you can see there, there's quite a bit difference. So there was an ongoing dispute at that point in time between Texas and Mexico. So what were the long-term causes eventually of this war? Well, one was obviously manifest destiny, our belief that we had a God-given right to all of that land, from sea to shining sea. And in particular, was a strong desire for the state that eventually became known as California. The immediate causes at that point in time, Texas once again applies for statehood. And in 1845, the American president at that time, John Tyler, who was on his way out the door, decides to admit Texas into the Union. Of course, Mexico had always had this desire or this dream that Texas would come back. Now, with Texas gaining full statehood, they realized that that dream might not come true. At the same time, the United States is going to send an emissary to Mexico asking to buy California for more than the asking price of the entire Louisiana Purchase. Mexico refuses to sell California. Of course, the ongoing border dispute between, at one time, Texas and Mexico, which is now between the United States and Mexico. The effects of this, well, as you're going to see, we are going to accrue a great amount of territory, which eventually becomes known as the Mexican Cession.
The controversy over whether to admit Texas furthered the split between free and slave states in the United States Congress. Also, inevitably, the question of war with Mexico was raised.
Will we go to war over Texas? Gentlemen, Mexico has warned that the mere fact of annexation will be regarded by her as a declaration of war without any further formality.
In 1844, the election of President Polk was a resounding popular endorsement of westward expansion. It opened the way for the annexation of Texas.
say what you will, the United States has a manifest destiny to expand all the way to the Pacific Ocean. Texas must become a part of the United States, slavery and Mexico notwithstanding.
In 1845, despite northern opposition to slavery and the possibility of war with Mexico, the United States Congress formally admitted Texas as the 28th state in the Union. Now it seemed that war with Mexico was inevitable. John Slidell was sent to Mexico City to attempt to forestall a showdown over Texas and, if possible, purchase California in the bargain. The Mexicans refused to negotiate for land they considered their own. In 1846, United States troops occupied the disputed lands along the Rio Grande. Mexican troops took up the challenge of the American occupation of the Rio Grande. In April 1846, the Mexican War began. We blockaded Mexico's coasts and attacked her in the north. Kearny captured Santa Fe and marched west to support American settlers who'd raised our flag over the Mexican communities in California. And when victories in the north failed to discourage the Mexicans, we landed at Veracruz to aim a campaign at the heart of Mexico. In September of 1847, only a quarter of a century after American colonists had first come to Texas, U.S. forces were in Mexico City as conquerors. The Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo ended the war and redrew our Mexican boundary from the Rio Grande to California. We paid Mexico $15 million for most of what is now the Pacific Southwest.
Now, before all of that could take place, Polk had to settle the dispute with Great Britain over the Oregon Territory. He did not want to fight a war on two fronts. So, remember, he had made the campaign slogan 54-40 or fight. But in 1846, he is going to conclude a peace treaty with Great Britain, and the previous drawn boundary between Canada and the United States in the old Northwest, of course, that would be the Michigan, Minnesota area, would be extended all the way across. So instead of 54-40 or fight, it would now be at the 49th parallel. So that, of course, avoids a war in the Northwest. But the push to annex Texas occurred this before Polk actually takes office. Now, he wins on a promise to accept Texas, Tyler wishing to deny Polk the credit for bringing Texas into the Union, pushes it through Congress, and Congress accepts it. In the meantime, as a result of that, Mexico no longer has diplomatic relations with the United States. We, of course, will send John Slidell, whose name is going to come up later during the Civil War, to see if we can purchase California. As you saw in the film clip, that overture was rejected. So as war gets closer and closer, and then eventually breaks out with the excuse it was over the disputed border between Mexico and Texas, according to the official accounts, the Mexicans fired the first shots. But it would be the United States that would send troops into that disputed territory. Mexicans would then open fire, and now a war is being asked for by the president from Congress. Before that can happen, Congressman David Wilmot from Pennsylvania will wish to attach to that declaration of war something called the Wilmot Proviso. As you read there on the screen, the Wilmot Proviso said the United States essentially was not getting in this war to expand slavery. The United States, as a matter of fact, to highlight that point, would say that if any territory is gained as a result of this war, slavery will not be allowed into that territory. Now, you should know that behind the scenes and attached to the declaration of war was a proposal to take money and use it to bribe General Santa Anna, the man who was the villain of the Mexican War and of the massacres at Goliad and the Alamo, was in exile. We were going to bring him back into Mexico, use money to bribe him, and get him to surrender the Mexican forces and thereby end the war before it really even got started. Wilmot, catching wind of this, immediately wants to say that this money will not be used in any way, shape, or form to purchase territory on which slavery would be allowed. The Wilmot Proviso is going to open up a can of worms, if you will. Wilmot was not necessarily, though he was from Pennsylvania and a Quaker, was not necessarily opposed to slavery per se, but as you see there, he was afraid that Pennsylvanians who would then want to move to California would have to compete with slave labor in that state. So this was an effort to help his fellow Pennsylvanians if they tried to move on to California. This proviso would be debated during the entire war and would bring the North and South close to a split even before the war ended. In the meantime, one of the transcendentalists of that era, Henry David Thoreau, would publish an essay, and the essay would simply be titled On Civil Disobedience. And what he would show was nonviolent ways to oppose the war. Ironically, this manifesto that he publishes would later become a blueprint for a gentleman by the name of Mahatma Gandhi in pushing in a nonviolent way for India's freedom from rule by Great Britain, which they would secure after World War II. And the other irony is that Dr. Martin Luther King, beginning in the 1950s, as he took control of the civil rights movement, would use Gandhi's tactics, again, for nonviolent opposition in order to gain his objectives. So it went full circle from America to India and back to America again. This was an unpopular war. And just as the War of 1812 was opposed by New England, so too was the war opposed not as vehemently as New England did in the War of 1812, but was opposed by many East Coast interests. They felt this was a war simply to expand slavery. Polk,
I tell you, I don't get no respect at all.
Takes this man, General Zachary Taylor, and puts him in charge of American forces. Ironically, from the very beginning, what Polk feared was that Taylor might use his successes, if there were any, to vault himself into the presidency in 1850, 4 years hence. So there was always that fear from Polk, and that would kind of color how Polk would support Old Rough and Ready, as his soldiers called him. Taylor is going to win victory after victory. In this war, the United States would be vastly outnumbered in every major battle, sometimes by as many as 5-1, and yet they would win every battle. Now, one of the myths surrounding this war is this was the United States fostering war upon an unwilling participant, namely Mexico. Nothing could be further from the truth. Mexico, whose army was rated as one of the best in the world at that time, even had designs on landing ships in Washington, D.C., and conquering the capital. So their desire for war was no less than that of the United States. So Taylor now crosses the Nueces into what Mexico considered their territory, and then he's going to cross the Rio Grande. You can see the various campaigns, the various battles that are fought. We're not going to get into them. Eventually, Polk, because he fears Taylor's popularity, will replace him with General Winfield Scott, known by his men as Old Fuss and Feathers. Scott was a by-the-book guy, dressed immaculately in his uniform, and was so big he needed the help of a crane in order to get on top of his horse. And we'll talk more about Scott, particularly as we approach the Civil War. But he, like Taylor, is going to win victory after victory. In the meantime, Polk is going to capture the capital of Mexico, Mexico City, there in September of 1847. Polk will send down a gentleman by the name of Nicholas Trist to negotiate a treaty. But as Trist is negotiating the treaty, which eventually becomes known as the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, Polk starts having second thoughts. He didn't think it was going to be this easy. Now, all of a sudden, we've captured the capital. So perhaps we could get more from Mexico. Perhaps, Polk thought, we could capture and conquer all of Mexico and bring that into the orbit of the United States. When Trist's wife in Washington, D.C. gets wind of this, she sends a message to Trist urging him to get back to Washington as soon as possible with the treaty that he's negotiated. And as the Congress is considering Polk's proposals, Trist appears with a treaty which ends the war on terms favorable to the United States and accrues a great deal of territory. We are going to get 500,000 square miles, and for a minimal cost.
Ensuing the independence of Texas in 1845, boundary disputes between Mexico increased. Mexico claimed the Nueces River as the border, whereas the Texans argued for the Rio Grande. The Texas Army entered the disputed area and blockaded the Mexican ports on the Gulf and Pacific coasts. After several decisive military victories, the Texans invaded Mexico City. The Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo finally ended the war and established the Rio Grande as the border. Between this treaty and the Gadsden Purchase, the United States acquired over 500,000 square miles, including modern-day California, New Mexico, Arizona, Texas, Utah, and Nevada. Ensuing
So this is the land that becomes known as the Mexican Cession. All the land that you see here in green is land that we got from Mexico. Of course, the Republic of Texas was already part of the United States, but now was guaranteed that freedom because of Mexican non-intervention. The area that you see here in blue, the Gadsden Purchase, that's going to be something a little bit different. We will pay for this little slice of land almost as much as we paid for all of the Louisiana Purchase. And what was it about that land? Well, we'll take a look at that in a second. But Trist's hurried trip back to DC with the treaty saves America from further war and expansion into the heartland of Mexico. Polk was not too thrilled with Trist coming back, but nonetheless, he accepted it and, ironically, will only serve that one term in office. But he brings as much land or more land into America, more so than Jefferson or any other president, past or present. Now, you see the Gadsden Purchase at the bottom of the map. Why did we want that land? Well, we all know eventually, as a result of the Bear Flag Revolt, and of course, if you look at California today, what's its state flag? It is a bear flag. As a result of the Bear Flag Revolt, California was in control of Americans by the time the Mexican American War ended. And of course, what happens just 2 years later? Well, of course, the discovery of gold at Sutter's Mill. This is going to prompt a mass exodus of people from the South and from the East, hopscotching over this area directly into California, everybody looking for gold. The ports of Los Angeles, later on San Francisco, become giant parking lots for boats as crews leave in their quest for riches. So what's that got to do with the Gadsden Purchase? Well, this area is mostly flat. And the idea was a railroad bypassing or not having to go over the Rocky Mountains, a railroad running directly from Texas across the Gadsden Purchase into California would be a way to link California with the South and, of course, provide a quick and easy way to get to California. That was the motivation behind the Gadsden Purchase. So this is what America looked like at the end of the Mexican-American War. And then with the Gadsden Purchase in 1853, we filled out what eventually would become known as our continental boundaries. Later on, of course, to add Alaska and Hawaii. So all of this land was secured by Polk, with the exception of the Gadsden Purchase. But now the problem is going to arise: what happens to that land? The election of 1848 is going to find Polk's fear realized, but not the man he expected. He thought that Taylor was now out of the way when he was replaced by Scott. However, Taylor is going to secure the nomination of the Democratic or the Whig Party and will run for the presidency against a Democrat by the name of Lewis Cass. Taylor is from Virginia. Taylor is a slaveholder. And so many Whigs and Democrats alike were going to vote for Taylor because they thought that his Southern roots and his connection to slavery would ensure that the Mexican Cession would become slave territory. But nothing could be further from the truth. You see Taylor's lead in electoral votes and a slight lead in popular votes. It would be another transcendentalist, Ralph Waldo Emerson, who says the United States will conquer Mexico, but it will be as the man who swallows the arsenic which brings him down in return. Mexico will poison us. And poison us it did. It put the issue of slavery and the expansion of that institution at the forefront of American politics leading up to the Civil War. So, manifest destiny, that American idea that God has given us the right to expand from sea to shining sea, will bring us the areas that you see pictured on the screen, and will vault us into fiery 50s, the 1850s, which will be body blow after body blow, eventually resulting in the election of Abraham Lincoln and the secession of the southern states to be known as the Confederacy, bringing about the Civil War.